Project Management, Chapter 15. In Chapter 15, we talk about the issues in managing international projects. So we have several things that come into account when we're working with people from multiple countries and multiple diverse backgrounds. So we're going to talk about first of international assignments. Positives are that we can have increased income. We certainly have increased responsibilities in trying to navigate people working in different teams. There are career opportunities, opportunities for growth. We're able to travel to a lot of different countries and meet new people, do different things. So it's always great to have your travel paid for by the company that you work for when you get to go to a lot of great destinations in other countries. Various negatives then are being away from family and friends. So if you would move to another country for 3 months or 2 months or even 6 weeks to take part in managing a project, you would be away from your family for that amount of time. There are also personal risks dependent on where you're located and what the safety of that location is. So there are a lot of countries that different projects can happen in that you might not be safe in. You might have to travel with a companion, have somebody with you. Especially if you're a woman, you might not be able to leave your hotel and go to areas by yourself. You could miss career opportunities at home. And you could have difficulties with foreign language, culture, and laws. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the various forms of culture shock. So this graphic is a list of the various environmental factors affecting international projects. And we're going to look at each one of these one at a time throughout the next couple of slides. So first, environmental factors are legal and political. So what is the political condition of that country and the area that you're in? How are their laws and regulations different than the laws and regulations that you work with in the United States or your home country? What are the bureaucracies that you have to go through? So different countries, in addition to different rules and regulations, might have different red tape and different forms and things that you have to go through. Is there government interference or support? Is the government corrupt? Do they require bribery as a practice, which the United States forbids in business? How secure is the country? Are there instances of terrorism? Do you have to hire your own security? Does your company offer security? What are the risks of local crime and kidnapping? And various other risk management projects. If you were taking on a project in areas that are near or within countries that have a lot of issues with war and violence, there could even be project risk management to your actual project when you're having to navigate that there's high theft in the country, so you could have materials stolen all the time. If there's a possibility of your location being vandalized or even bombed, depending on what location that you're in. So things that you have to consider. The next environmental factor is the geography. So what's the climate of the area? How hot does it get? How cold does it get? Are there seasonal differences? For example, right now in South America and Australia, New Zealand, places south of the equator, they're entering their summer seasons while we're entering our winter seasons. The textbook talks about issues with working in countries in Sweden where they have periods of 20 hours of sunlight and 4 hours of darkness and how that interferes with sleep. What are the geographical obstacles? There are different things. So I used to work for the College of Agriculture at Iowa State and working with faculty who are working on projects in multiple different countries. Some of those geographical obstacles for agriculture related projects would be, what are the soil conditions? How do we have farm machinery available, or are we doing this by hand? What are the rainfall issues? But a lot of it is, what is the soil consistent of? You can see this in other projects too. So we lived in Ames for 7 years, and Ames has a high clay soil content. And one of the things that they found out with was they did these really high-end property areas or new subdivisions where they built high-end housing, but then people hated living there because they couldn't grow trees, because the high amount of clay in their soil, every tree that they planted would just die. And so they would have all of these neighborhoods with no trees because they couldn't get them to live. So thinking about all of these various impacts that we can potentially have on projects. We also have economic conditions. Not only what money is available, what are the inflation rates, when we have exchange rates with currency, we can have gains and losses within that, but also what is the local labor force? If we need employees in that country, what is their education? Do we have the amount of skill levels and educational levels that we need for the labor force for that particular project? And then infrastructure. With infrastructure, do they have internet? Do they have electricity, reliable electricity? Do they have disruption in their power services? Are they going to have forest fires a couple of times a year that last for 3 to 6 months at a time? And do we need to time that? And will that take out power and telecom networks? We also see educational systems under infrastructure. So what are their school buildings like? What types of education are available? And what technologies are available? How far do we have to go to the nearest city or for specific types of equipment? And then the culture. So culture is so many things: how their family structure is, what their values and philosophies are, whether they expect everyone to speak in their own language, in the language of that country, or whether they've embraced English. And you'll need a translator, or you'll need to already know that language, what the customs are, and especially if you run into multicultural environments. But even the textbook addressed a couple of these. So in some countries, punctuality is considered very, very important, where in other countries, you can be 45 minutes to an hour late and you wouldn't even expect to apologize for that, because everyone should just assume that time is fluid. We have some countries that have a natural midday break, so a siesta. So there are multiple countries that have a midday break of several hours instead of working 8 to 5 with a 20-minute break or a 30-minute lunch or something like that. So different changes in how even the workday is issued. In Japan, there are very formal business customs of how we bow and how we take a business card from someone. So there's a whole social standard of how you would accept a business card from another person in Japan versus what we would do with a business card in the United States, and how we could offend people very deeply from other countries. So we have to think about all of these things in conjunction with each other when we're looking at working in international projects. This is an example of a scoring matrix for the site selection. So we have a project, we have 3 different sites that we're looking at as potentials for this project. And this could even be just a retailer looking to expand out into international areas, and where are we going to do our first global expansion of our retail market. So we have ratings based on political stability, worker supply, cultural compatibility, infrastructure, government support, product to market advantage, and then that continues on the next page with transportation, the workforce education, the utilities you have available to you, telecommunications, phone and internet, and the suppliers. So can we get supplies and equipment readily in that country? Do we need to bring it with us? How far are we going to have to transport it to? Now remember, all of that also adds money to the project. When we look at cultural differences, we see that, of course, the high definition of culture is that it's a system of shared norms, beliefs, values, and customs that bind people together, that create a shared meaning and unique identity. We all have our own individual culture within our own family unit. Then we have regional culture, and that regional culture can be very local, and then state culture, and then expand out. Just even think about how many different norms, beliefs, values, and customs that you can think about between people in your family, and what customs and values and beliefs you have, and then people that you've met in college that didn't grow up in Iowa and have different values and customs and norms and stuff. Especially if we're looking at cross-cultural projects. So if we have people, we're not just working with one, project manager from one country is working with a team in another country, but we're talking about multiple people from multiple countries trying to pull a project together. So we've already talked about time zone issues. Well, then we can also have ethnic and religious differences. So we see this in the United States also. Most of the United States businesses run on a Christian calendar, where we give time off at Christmas, we give time off at various Christian holidays, but we don't give time off for other ethnic or religious holidays, even though we have a wide variety of religions and ethnicities within the United States. So why do we default to Christian holidays and practices? What is the language? Are you dealing with one language? Are you dealing with 5 languages? What are the economic issues and the different dollar amounts that are affected by those things? Okay. So also, when we're talking about cross-cultural considerations, we have our ethnocentric perspective. So this is the tendency to believe that our cultural values and ways of doing things are superior to all others. This can also be org specific. So if you've ever gone into a business or worked in a business and heard the expression, but this is the way we've always done it. So that comes down to an ethnocentric perspective. We believe that the way that we've always done it, the way that we personally experience it, is the best way and the better way of doing things. And so we need to make adjustments for that, and we need to be respective of diversity and cultural differences in order to make projects work together, and in order for us to be able to work in multiple different locations. Because if we're open to adaptations and adjustments, we just become a more valuable employee to the organization we're doing project management for, if we're able to adapt and respect all of these various differences. So the book also talks about working in different countries, and they bring up a couple of different things that people in those countries value versus the United States and other things. So where I talk about one where we have siestas, or we have very formal business practices, or women have to be covered at all times and aren't allowed to go outside on their own. We have different religious practices and stuff, and that affects our ability to work in other countries or causes various different struggles. So some of these cross-cultural orientations that are addressed in the book would be this relationship to nature. So how we relate to the natural world around us and to the supernatural. So what are our religious beliefs, and how do we believe that religion affects what we do? So one of the examples the textbook talks about is a country who believe that God controls everything that happens in our life. And so if we are an hour late for a meeting, that was destined to happen. Do we respect nature? Do we, where we wouldn't build on sacred land, whether it was the perfect location or not? Time orientation also, not only just our risk management and how far we look out into the future, but do we focus on the past? Do we focus on the here and now? Do we focus on the future? Do we live in the moment? Doer control, basic nature of people. Do we believe that people are generally good or evil or a mix of these two? Well, that comes back to our cultural and our religious values. And then what are our relationships among people? So that's the degree of responsibility we feel that we have for others. These are all part of the Kluckhohn-Strodbeck's cross-cultural framework discussed in the textbook. So this line indicates where the United States falls on these issues. So we believe that we have a dominant relationship with nature, that as a human, and these are all very broad generalizations that I'm saying here. I'm not saying that everyone in the United States believes this. I'm saying that the United States culturally as a whole tends to fall under these. So time orientation, closer to future looking but very present oriented. Our activity orientation is that we're doing. We believe people can be good and evil or a mixture of both, and we're very individualist people as far as our relationships. The Hofstede Cultural Dimensions Framework looks at individualism versus collectivism. So the United States would be an individualist country versus many Asian countries that have collectivism. The power distance, so the degree to which we accept status and power differences among people. So do we believe that power distances are high or low? The textbook talks about in France where status is maintained, and your social status and your social standing is one of the very important things in France. The uncertainty avoidance, so our willingness to accept uncertainty and ambiguity about the future. And the masculine versus the feminine, so the degree to which the culture emphasizes competitive achievement oriented behavior, or we look at concerns for relationships. So this graphic shows examples of countries that are broken down by collectivism, individualism, and then have higher power distance and low power distance under Hofstede's dimensions. When we're going to work in another country, we need to be prepared. Are there translators available? Who is speaking English? Do we know another language? Who do we have to guide us and give us tips about the cultural to make sure that we are following the appropriate procedures of the country? The book also talks about culture shock. So culture shock is just this natural psychological disorientation that people suffer when they move into a different culture. And there are 4 different. So we have the honeymoon when we're first there, and then we become irritable and hostile against the customs and the culture. Then we have gradual adjustment and then adaptation. And the number of months that we're within that culture affect how well we go through these stages of the culture shock cycle. When we're coping with culture shock, we want to look for various ways to help us get through those behaviors and the negative impact it's having on us. So one, looking for stability zones that closely or recreate home. So one of the things that I always hear from people when they're talking about culture shock is not having access to food that they're used to. And I experience this myself when I travel. So when I travel, for the first couple of days, I'm really excited. So that's that honeymoon phase that I'm really excited about all of the new things that I get to try. But after a couple of days, I just want something comfortable and that I'm used to, that I just want. So then I start craving things, you know, that's when you're more likely to go to a McDonald's in another country, just because that's one of those stability zones. You know what McDonald's is going to be like, and you're trying to recreate things that you can have at home. So focusing on what we're doing as our project, trying to find ways to distract ourselves when we're really struggling being in a different culture. When we're trying to decide if we're going to move to another country and take on an international project, we would think about any of these things. Who we decide, a company decides that they're going to choose, is going to be based on these kinds of things. So are they used to traveling? Do they have good physical and emotional health? Do they have work experience with other cultures? What's their recent background or heritage, or their ability to adapt? I used to work on a project when I was at Iowa State with a company that has a lot of international business and trade, and they have locations in many countries, and they used to send their employees over to work in other countries. And they had a lot of failures because of culture shock and various other issues that are talked about in this chapter. And so then they developed a training program with their employees. So if employees were thinking about going international for a project, or moving over for a year or 2 or 3 to work at one of these other locations, they would go through this intensive training first before they sent them over to another country, so that the culture shock was reduced and the ability to adapt and work with other people within that country was increased. Personally, if we want to travel internationally and we want to be an international project manager, the areas for training that we might want to increase are just knowledge of things outside of our own personal norm. So understanding various different religions and their cultures and traditions. What are the dress codes in countries that we're looking at? What are the holidays that are important to them? Eating patterns, family life, business protocols especially. So how do we interact when we're introduced with each other, social etiquette, and other issues. So we want to make sure that we're getting as much information as possible. And we talk about 3 different ways that we can learn approaches to cultural fluency. So the first one is the information giving approach, where we just learn from a lecture. And then the effective approach, which we're looking at the learning of information and skills that raise the effective responses on the part of the trainee and result in cultural insights. And then, of course, the most effective, the behavioral experiential approach, which provides the trainee with realistic simulations or scenarios that they're actually going to encounter so that they can practice that. And the last slide looks at the relationship between the length and rigor of training and the amount of cultural fluency required. So if we're going to move there for 1 to 3 years, we need a high level of training, we need experiential training, extensive language training. Where if we're just going to go there for a couple of weeks, we just need some quick information, and we can do that lecture only approach. So those various different things. Like I said, the company that I used to work with sent people over for 1 to 3 years, and they were having really high turnover and people getting homesick and wanting to come home before their 3 years were up. And so they created a much more extensive training program so their employees were prepared for that. That is chapter 15.